Stop citing sources and stop trusting statistics. I know that sounds extreme, but quite recently, online debate has been dominated by a culture of asking for sources, citing sources, and making correlative arguments. It's no secret that, for good reason, I'm no fan of this. I made a video going over a few of my critiques on empiricism, but I didn't really want to linger on it too much because the argument of empiricism versus rationalism is a complex one. Empiricism in and of itself is not a flawed ideology. Observations are an important tool in the quest for truth. However, as much as I wanted to move on and cover the more baseless ideologies of Marxism, subjectivism, and postmodernism, recent arguments I've gotten into online have made it clear that the influences of defunct schools of thought like logical positivism and positivism in general cannot be ignored. So at the risk of being ridiculed, let me double down and say this again. Stop using sources. I know that sounds like that lacks a lot of nuance, and that's because it does. It's a bit of a hyperbolic rule for which, of course, there are many exceptions. But let's talk about those to understand why I'm being so blunt. First of all, I know no matter what I say here, no matter how logically sound it is, that will never change the fact that just as you and I are socially conditioned to believe what I'm saying is blasphemy, even if I change your mind, the rest of the world will ostracize you and ridicule you just as they do me anytime I bring this up. I'd also be skimming over very important questions in this argument if I didn't acknowledge the necessity of authority in the division of labor. I can't remember when I said this, but I believe in the past I put it very simply. Not every man can be his own farmer, engineer, his own physician. Society has a purpose, and by extension, these social norms of authority, of peer review, of separation of disciplines have a purpose. Not everyone is intelligent enough to make complicated decisions of science, medicine, and even ethics. But even without delving into politics or civics, I think there's actually a really easy solution there. And ironically, you may be tempted to call me an elitist. Because simply put, if that's the case, then the average man shouldn't have input on those sorts of decisions. Again, what that actually means in terms of being enforced would be a long political argument. But for the sake of the video, I'm not even arguing that this should be enforced. I'm just stating the obvious. If you don't know something, or more importantly, don't understand something, you don't need to cite a source. You should just not talk about it. It's that simple. The division of labor in which we trust experts in their respective field needs to be kept in check by critical thought. Otherwise, you are just providing the corrupt with an army of blind followers. You are allowing your ignorance to be weaponized for power and profit. But I know, most of you will say, well, that's not me, and honestly, most of you will probably be right. To an extent. No one drop of rain feels responsible for the flood. Yes, I know that you likely just use sources for people who are unwilling to listen to reason. And hey, I do the same too sometimes, so I'm not judging you. But we have to realize and own up to the fact that we are perpetuating this culture. It is their ridicule that keeps us playing by their rules, so we need to see through that, stop caring, and start fighting back. Especially since in most cases, this argument of authority that these people make is a thinly veiled one. Even if authority somehow in and of itself had meaningful power, when people cite sources, almost all arguments that they make are necessarily going to involve their interpretation of the data. So they aren't opining to the authority of the people they cite. They are just ritualizing and sanctifying their confirmation bias by finding sources that they believe agree with them, even if that's not necessarily what the sources show. And also, again, they do this assuming that sources have any value in general, let alone in the specific argument. I mean, for example, when you have two conflicting sources, which one do you choose? I know people will say the more credible one, as if that's an actual answer with any substance to it. What decides which source is more credible? Are we really going to say the one that has more people that agree with it? Well, I guess if that's the case, then all I have to do is get a bunch of college-educated people together and then truth's whatever I want, right? But of course, that's not how that works, now is it? After all, a lot of academics agree that appeal to authority is a fallacy, or that ad populum bandwagoning likewise is a flawed argument. Just to give a quote, Carl Sagan said appeals to authority are worthless. So if the consensus is that consensus doesn't determine truth, then it can't, because then it would determine that it's not true. And I mean, devoid of that, this is something anyone intuitively knows. Scientists 100 years ago got things wrong. Scientists 50 years ago got things wrong. And scientists today can still get things wrong. So what they say is not gospel. But again, I think we all know this. These appeals to authority are just made to give power to one's own beliefs and call them fact. But if you ever bring this up in a conversation, it won't matter. people will just immediately try to hide behind the excuse that, oh, they're not making an appeal to authority, because they are not saying it is right because of who presented it, they're just presenting the data itself. Which does bring us to what I think is the biggest and clearest exception to my rule. Because yes, I actually do understand that you can't just step outside your door and go, it's 33.1 gigatons carbon emissions today, yeah, globally. I really need to get surgery to fix my adenoids so I can breathe out of my nose. Obviously, the most reasonable and genuine instance in which you may find yourself compelled to use sources is when you need to consider observations that you yourself cannot make. But here, I still think a lot of things need to be taken into consideration. Obviously, I'm not going to say that you can't or shouldn't use sources in these circumstances, but it's not exactly fair to say that things here are going to be black and white. First of all, you cannot claim that you are not making an appeal to authority if what you're citing is at all qualitative. Because then, unless it's relevant for making an internal critique or reductio ad absurdum, for example, what I did with Carl Sagan and the consensus among appeal to authority, where I am bringing up figures of authority to prove inconsistencies in the belief of authority itself. Then, in making a qualitative argument, you could have just not referenced the source. If you are saying this is true regardless of who says it, so I am not appealing to the authority of the person who said it, then why bring up who said it? And I'm not talking about referencing a source as a means of providing someone with further information. If I reference Kantian ethics, that doesn't mean that I think Immanuel Kant is incapable of being wrong, or necessarily mean that I am trying to shut down a conversation by implying that someone cannot think that he is wrong. I am just referencing his work so that the other person can further understand what I mean, and so I don't have to recite his entire life's work just to make one point from his beliefs. But that reasonable limitation to communication doesn't excuse how people would likely try to exploit this. If I am referencing his work, it is only to aid in communicating my point. So since the point is still mine, that means I have the burden of communicating it. If I am trying to prove a qualitative, or perhaps more accurately described, a priori, non-observed fact, then I can't just tell the other person to look it up, or hide myself behind the authority of the person I borrowed it from. Because if the argument is true by its own merit, then I should let the argument speak for itself. Now, likewise, all qualitative data, as you could call it, it is going to necessarily involve judgments being made by the source that you are citing, and as such is an appeal to authority. In other words, if you aren't taking an argument like in the previous example, but instead if you are citing what you believe to be pure data, if it is something like quality of life, quality of healthcare, or quality of education, that all requires judgments to be made on what standards define the measurements of those things. And by the same reason, the unfortunate part is that this is even to an extent true of quantitative data. There rarely ever is such a thing as pure data. You have to call into question how they're measuring it. If we're some sort of medical industry and we are testing the safety of our new surgical procedure, how do we measure who is dying from it? Do we only count the people who died there during surgery? Do we count the people in the days after, the weeks after, months after? What if they die from a heart attack? Did our surgery cause that, or would that have happened anyways? You may ask yourself, well, do we think that our surgery could cause a heart attack? But that's the point. Think. Not only can we see how difficult it is on our end as the people using these sources, but hopefully putting you into the shoes of the people compiling these findings, you'll begin to see just how inconclusive empiricism actually is. Correlative arguments mean nothing devoid of deeper philosophical understandings of their relevance. In fact, just in general, the very inductive nature of empirical science means, to vastly oversimplify it, that it can't actually prove anything. This is a truth that has faded into obscurity, but likely you've heard someone say something around the lines of, well, it's just a theory, so it isn't true. While obviously that's not the case, because even if it was a random guess, it would still have a chance of being right, and obviously theories are far from being random guesses, there's a sentiment here that reflects the truth. How do I say this without sounding like a cringy pseudo-intellectual? I don't know if I can, so here we go. Taking observations and inferring a cause, that's a formal fallacy. That's called affirming the consequent. You have this hypothesis that A causes B, and so you look for instances of B to infer A. The issue is, however, that there could be other causes of B. The mere presence of B does not imply A. When someone says correlation doesn't equal causation, that isn't some far-right talking point. That is a fundamental logical truth that we have been so far indoctrinated into forgetting. And I do mean forget, because for the convenience of their delusions, people will try to ridicule me as if I'm trying to debunk science. Which, as I said, even if I was, so be it, ridicule me. But this is not science. This is propaganda thinly veiled as science. Scientists of the past, and hopefully some still today, would understand what I'm saying and wouldn't deny it. Because in actual science, it's something that's already taken into consideration. If there could be other causes of B, then simply isolate whatever system of causation you have, such that you know nothing else could cause it besides A. Guess what? That's just called a control. And maybe, yes, even in this we can still never truly confirm that A causes B. Because unknown to us, something else could still be acting in our system, something we didn't take into account. But the more control we have, the more likely it is that our conclusion is true up until the point of near certainty. So this raises one last question. What drives this process? Is it observation? Well, how can we say that it's observation? If observation is what further proves a statement, and the statement we started out with was unproven, then how could that be? And why would we aim to test an already tested statement? Not to mention, you can't prove observations, they just are. If things were proven by observation, and observations needed to be proven, that would just cause an infinite regress of always needing a proof for the previous observation. No, we began with our hypothesis, an idea that we reasoned out. It is something that, from our own minds, we deemed likely. And you could argue that it is something that we reasoned from previous observations, causing another regress, but at least this one I think we can solve. Because this process, the scientific method, hasn't existed forever, and neither have you. At one point, nobody told you what to think. There was no authority to inform you as to which statements were true, because as an infant, it would have just been noise to you. You can tell me your lies of authority all day long until you are blue in the face. But learning comes second to understanding. For whatever you can bring up and argue that all knowledge comes from being taught or from observations, you first needed to know how to learn, and that itself was unlearned. And just the same, the scientific method could not have been invented by its own means. As we can see, it's essentially a hybrid of inductive and deductive reasoning with the aim of being more like deductive reasoning. And the very proof I used to explain its value is likely what gave it life in the first place. Meaning, at its core, the scientific method owes itself to formal logic, and is bound to thought itself, as no observation was necessary for its conception. There are just some things that must naturally be implied. And I probably didn't explain this as well in the previous video, but this is why I see this extreme form of empiricism as not just being a flawed ideology, but being a denial of fundamental truth. If things in reality can act on each other such that they have relationships, and our statements are supposed to mirror reality describing it, then to say that one statement cannot predict another is a denial of the fact that in reality one thing acts on another such as our statements would predict. And the only resolutions to this issue are to falsely believe that no truth can be known, which itself would be a statement of truth falsifying the statement. Or what must necessarily be true. Reasoning is a fundamental aspect of truth. You cannot ignore sound reasoning in favor of an empirical study. While yes, observation is what verifies the theoretical and can, by some standard, invalidate it, in order to have a set of statements that mirror reality, there has to be a logically consistent set of statements. So reason is what comes first, giving direction to the observations we make, and then it has final say, because after all observations have been made, if our statements or our beliefs are not consonant, then we have made an error in observation or an error in judgment. So, I could say it one more time. Don't cite sources. Don't blindly believe statistics as if correlation means anything. But I think we all know that the world isn't going to suddenly change overnight because of this one video. People will continue to use sources, and as such, people like you and I will find ourselves compelled in desperate circumstance to use them as well. So really all I can do is make a few more videos going over statistics to provide people like you with the tools to combat this culture. But until then, if any of you disagree with anything that I have said, please feel free to provide me sources disproving the concept of appeal to authority. Sources disproving the nature of theories in the scientific method. which is something you should have learned in middle school. And most importantly, a source that proves that you need sources, which I am, of course, going to need a source for. And a source for that. 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 And then another source for that. And then another source for that. And then a source for that.